and all was known. You could feel beauty rising.
Hi, my name is Sue Skasky with Vermont Volunteer Services for Animals Humane Society, and welcome to our show For the Animals. Today is part 2 of a 2-part series, a very important issue. In recent weeks, it's been discussed in the newspapers, and I've actually heard people discussing this, which is an old issue that's coming to the surface again. And it's about fawn rehabilitation in the state of Vermont and why it's denied. With us today, we have Nancy Carey, who's a returning guest. Thank you, Nancy. Nancy has been a licensed wildlife rehabilitator with mammals since 1992, and you specialize in skunks,
Raccoons, skunks, and foxes, and woodchucks.
and squirrels.
I do squirrels, porcupines, opossums, everything, but those are my specialty, those 4.
Thank you. Donna Norton lives in Stocksboro, Vermont, and she became a licensed wildlife rehabilitator in 2003, working primarily with fawn and black bear cubs until 2 years ago.
Correct.
Black bear had to be so
Amazing.
amazing. We have to
Yes.
talk about that. And Julia Westervelt Gresser lives in Marshfield, Vermont, and she maintains a psychotherapy practice in Montpelier. Thank you all for coming down. We've discussed what's happened in the newspaper. Julia rescued a fawn and had it at her property, and it was she tried many avenues to find help for this fawn and was unsuccessful. So she took it upon herself to feed, and the fawn was actually flourishing when the Fish and Wildlife game warden came and took it off her property and killed it. It seems that perhaps the Fish and Wildlife are afraid that people are going to start perceiving deer as Bambi and become sympathetic, and it's going to be that slippery slope with hunting. While the only legitimate reason that comes to my mind is disease. And I know that the state changed their policy to stop fawn rehabilitation in 2005. Can somebody give me the background on chronic wasting disease? Do we have it in Vermont and surrounding states? Donna, can you talk to that?
I can try.
Okay.
Right. Chronic wasting disease is a nervous system disease that affects the brains of deer, and it affects their brain cells, and the brain deteriorates, and eventually the deer loses weight and eventually dies. It is a disease to be concerned about and to pay attention to. And it's been in the western states, probably since the mid-60s, Nancy.
Yes,
is that
in
correct?
Colorado.
In 2005, there was one case, there were 2 cases of chronic wasting disease in a captive herd in Oneida County, New York. And at that point, the decision was made very quickly by the then Commissioner, Wayne LaRoche, to prohibit fawn rehabilitation. There was a great concern about the disease spreading to the state. And the issue of fawn rehabilitation was never discussable, never negotiable. It was simply stopped.
It doesn't sound like there's a valid reason, though.
There isn't, and we know more about that at this point. We know that the disease did not spread in the wild in New York. They tested it, they had containment areas, and that was back in 2005, and we haven't had any cases since then. Every state around us, and every state that Nancy checked in with recently, that we could
13 states
rehabilitate fawn.
Donna, then does the state have any valid reason to prohibit fawn rehabilitation? And also, what do you think of Commissioner Berry's statement in the Times-Argus that, quote, some states do rehab fawn, but he doesn't know why?
Right.
He hasn't picked up the phone and asked.
He hasn't figured it out,
Borders
I
around
guess.
Vermont.
If the disease, first of all, and this was true even in 2005, if the disease is not in the state, then how can it be spread by rehabbing a fawn that is born in the state?
I couldn't understand that.
I never understood that. biologists they're claiming that they're protecting the wild herd by not rehabilitating fawn. But it is simply not a valid reason to not care for native fawn, because it isn't even in New York. And if it's not here, and if it's not in the herd, how can a fawn spread it? So the disease is serious. The disease should have precautions. Most states do have precautions about not bringing live animals. Basically, chronic wasting disease is just a disease for mule deer, moose, elk, that species, I guess I would say. And they have regulations about transporting those animals to Vermont or to their states, I'm sorry. And they have regulations about the care of the hides and that. But no other states that we know are prohibiting fawn rehabilitation because of that disease.
Can I just add something
Absolutely.
to that?
Please, yeah.
I had done some research last night about this, because this is one of the major points that Patrick Berry has made, is that Vermont is doing an excellent job of trying to prevent chronic wasting disease, and that's a major reason why they don't allow fawn to be rehabilitated. And so I was researching, for example, Massachusetts. And again, Massachusetts, like Vermont, has never had a case of chronic wasting disease. But after the case or cases in New York, the Massachusetts Fish and Game Department met, and they instituted strong regulations to prevent chronic wasting disease. So I read through those strong requirements and regulations to prevent chronic wasting disease, which they mentioned they had joined with other New England states in coming together to set these guidelines. And there are 3 major guidelines, all of which have to do with importation of all species of live deer from other states. Usually they're imported for commercial purposes. Importing deer carcasses from other states and the Canadian provinces that have confirmed cases of chronic wasting disease, and importing or to process or possess whole carcasses or parts of deer and or elk from states that might have chronic wasting disease. So there's absolutely nothing in any of those regulations that I could find that has anything to do with rehabilitating fawns. And again, apparently none of the states, Maine, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Massachusetts, or New York, have regulations that prohibit the rehabilitation of fawns. And I'm sure that those states are as concerned as we are, as Vermont is. It just doesn't seem likely to me that Vermont is more concerned with chronic wasting disease and the deer population than all these other states. It doesn't add up to me. I just don't find that credible.
Could you read the first point again?
Yeah.
With commercial?
Yeah.
I'm trying to wrap my mind around that one.
The first regulation was to prohibit the importation of all species of live deer, which are commonly raised
farms.
for commercial purposes.
What do you mean deer farm?
They have deer farm that they have
For venison.
For
Right.
hunters to come to
right.
a
Oh, canned hunts.
Canned hunts, but they
Yes.
also have them for venison.
For restaurants and such.
things like that, yes.
I see.
We don't have those here, with the exception of an elk farm.
Right.
So
Not anymore, that is.
even in 2005, when the first case of chronic wasting disease was found in New York, even at that point, Vermont was the only state that immediately prohibited fawn rehabilitation. All the other states continued. They put in good practices, and they came up with protocol, but they didn't stop caring for the fawn.
The other state's philosophy is that they would rather have animals in the hands of people who are experienced,
Yes.
who know what they're doing, feeding the appropriate food to those species, the type of grain and browse that they're supposed to eat naturally. That the licensed wildlife rehabilitator, and we're talking best practices, not people that don't do well, but those that practice wildlife rehabilitation to the best standards. To have those animals, or any wild animals, into the hands of those people who know what they're doing, and they're not raising them as pets, and get those animals back into the wild. Euthanize the ones that can't go back into the wild. That's part of this whole thing, the negative part of it. But that is something that the department, the state itself can track. Wildlife rehabilitators have always been on the forefront of discerning diseases, because we handle animals from all over and different species. It was wildlife rehabilitators who first found out about West Nile virus with raising corvids, crows, ravens, blue jays. So it was a wildlife rehabilitator who noticed these symptoms coming up in their birds that they were admitting for rehab. And so the same thing can happen with any disease. People that are handling animals, not just studying them, but those that are on the forefront handling these animals. Same thing with threatened and endangered species. When a wildlife rehabilitator who does raptors gets in a couple of hawks or owls that are shot, they're protected animals, that are shot from a certain area, that information goes back to the department, and they can take legal action. They can look for problems. So you would think that it would be best to have animals cared for in the appropriate hands, and the department be able to track those people that are licensed to do it.
I'm curious, when decisions are made within the Department of Fish and Wildlife, are rehabbers brought in to the table?
Not usually, not usually.
I found out that when I started the Fawn Rehabilitation Program, I gained the training, set up the enclosure, set up a network of veterinarians to work with me, invested in foods. It's a huge investment, and basically I received a letter from the state saying you can't do it anymore, and there was no discussion. And to this date, not one person has said what was your success rate. How did you do it? They just simply don't reach out to us.
But you are the experts in the field.
I don't know that they see, I don't know that Commissioner Barry sees us that way. And in fact, he has made the statement that what we know, what we say, and what the biologists say can't even be in the same conversation. For instance, when he says that fawn can't be rehabilitated successfully, or that he doesn't know why other states do it, he's referring to two very poorly done studies, one in Connecticut and one in Michigan. Missouri, I'm sorry, where it was extremely poor rehabilitation practice. And it had very poor results for success. Sick fawn were released in one study.
In Connecticut, 3/4 of the fawns that were released had pneumonia before they were released. So they were releasing sick animals. I don't even know why the study was published, but that's one of 2 studies.
And the other study, the fawn were hard released, which means you load them up, you take them and you put them in an unfamiliar area without any extra support, no continued food.
And they were
and
10,
they were
10
young,
weeks.
and they were 10 weeks old. It's
beginning
poor
of winter.
in beginning of winter. Poor policy. But he will take those results done by biologists, and he'll say it can't even be in the same conversation as the experiences and the findings of rehabilitators who have been working with those animals.
Do you know what this commissioner or the past commissioner, what is their background? Do you know? Are they biologists? Is this a political appointment?
That's a good question.
I believe it's a political appointment, Nancy.
I don't know what their education is, or where they come, how they come into this position. I'm not sure about that.
It would seem it would only make sense to have somebody who's the head of an agency have the background.
Right.
So
There's one person who's listed as the wildlife biologist, and that's John Buck.
That's right.
It's possible, but it's an interesting question to ask, what is Patrick Berry's background?
credentials for this
Yeah.
position.
And yes,
There are
they
other
do
biologists.
have biologists that are consulting and advising the commissioner, but for some reason or other, he isn't reaching out to rehabilitators who have more knowledge, or not saying more knowledge than the biologist, but additional knowledge. That's the word that I want.
Well,
to
it's like
help
he's
them.
looking for the answer that he wants.
That is a very good assessment.
I just want to mention there are many biologists on this
Yeah.
list of employees for the Fish and Wildlife Department. I think John Buck was highlighted because he may be a person who specializes in the deer herd. And
That's right.
Adam is one of his assistants, Adam Mukowski.
So we're all animal lovers, and we're all a part of the big picture. Wildlife rehabilitators do one thing, veterinarians do another thing, and especially with wildlife in zoos, etc., and the biologists do another thing. And so we're all part and pieces of this big picture. And for us to not take into consideration the other parts of that, is very short-sighted. We're on the forefront with the public, providing a service for them because they care about wildlife, and that's why we have a Fish and Wildlife Department, is because the citizens care about the wildlife that are in this state. And so, if we take all of that into consideration, then we'll be more respectful of each other and we'll get a good job done. We'll fill all of the holes so that people will have resources. Personally, most rehabbers would like to work themselves out of a job where we don't have to intervene for little animals. But, if that's the case, then we need to provide that service for the general public. When they find an animal, we don't want to tell them that they shouldn't care about it, that they should step over it and walk on and ignore it. In some cases, we don't always, we very seldom take animals out of nature. It's usually some type of a cause that's come from people or our pets. Okay, hit by a car, cutting down trees without checking to see if there's a nest in there, burning brush that has a little cottontail nest in it or baby birds. So it's something that most of the time we've caused. Many times you'll get a call where somebody says that a hawk has caught a baby squirrel, and we tell them to walk away. The hawk has to eat, and you've got an injured animal, so you're not going to interfere with a lot of things like that. But in those cases where you do need to provide some assistance, the public can call us and they can trust us to do the best job we can.
And I also want to mention that all the work that you do is out of your own pocket.
It is that.
You are.
It is that.
That's a real, and I know it's not cheap.
I'm very proud of wildlife rehabilitators. It's an incredible sacrifice and an incredible commitment. Some do it year-round, taking in injured animals every month of the year. Others do it for a season, raising babies, and it's totally out of their pocket. And they're just so committed. Just so committed.
Especially
and it's a service. You don't wind up with anything in the end. You let those animals go one way or another. They go into the wild. It's not like raising your dog or cat.
24/7, round the clock.
Definitely. Depending on the species you take care of, it can be feeding every 2 hours.
And I know at the end of the season, Nancy, where's Nancy? She's sleeping. When does the season end?
For me, it's September. I very seldom have animals to winter over, but for the people that do birds, they get a lot of injured hawks and owls and songbirds in the wintertime, right straight through. People who do turtles, like Joanne Nichols in Burlington, it takes a long time for a turtle to heal, a shell to heal over.
Oh, I have to tell you.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt you. In fact, I want to go down to Connecticut and do this. I was in Connecticut a few weeks ago, driving along the road, and there was a turtle there. Turned around, I went back, I picked it up. Somebody had run over him, and his shell was cracked. And this was a Saturday. It's like, oh, come on. I found that there was a veterinarian 2 miles away. I brought the turtle to him, and they took him in right away. And they determined that the squirrel was still, he was focusing.
Turtle?
Yeah. And I called a week later, and the vet said, still alive, doing well. They were worried about infection, but since they'd gotten through the first week, they thought it was going to be okay, and I said, I want to come back down and do a show on this. But that's pretty exciting, so don't pass that turtle next time. Stop and
Right.
find help. Julia, why don't you address that right now?
It's been disheartening. When the fawn was alive and on the day that the fawn was shot, I had several interactions with various Fish and Game officials, and I felt that they were all respectful, and we had kind of a mutual meeting of the minds about the situation, even though it was sad and didn't turn out at all the way that I had hoped. But the communication with Patrick Berry has been almost completely through the newspaper, which is not ideal. But what's been disturbing to me is that I felt like he has consistently misrepresented the facts of what actually happened. He has consistently said that I took a fawn who was not orphaned, whose mother was probably just away, and in doing so, I really actually caused the fawn's death. He's also said that...
Excuse me, for people that didn't see part 1,
yeah.
Can you just talk very briefly about how the fawn came?
my neighbors had found a dead doe in the woods with a full udder, and then the next day they heard a fawn crying, and they found one fawn, then they found another fawn. The fawns were crying for several days before I got involved, and my neighbor, there was a big storm in Marshfield, and so I got involved with my neighbors trying to help them cut down trees from their car, and my neighbor told me this story that there are these fawns in the woods who are starving to death, and I went in and was able to find one fawn. But and from the start, that my neighbors called the state police when I called a Fish and Game, a wildlife rehabilitator. That wildlife rehabilitator apparently was required by law to inform the Fish and Game department that I had called and that I had a fawn. And so the Fish and Game department called me, and I told them consistently this same story over and over again about finding the mother dead, then finding the fawn, the fact that I had the fawn, but I wanted the fawn to be in a safe place. And Commissioner Berry presented this story in a very different way in the newspapers, in 2 newspaper articles and 1 op-ed that he did last week. He has consistently said over and over again that I illegally confiscated, I illegally took a fawn from the woods to make it a pet, which he knows. And the person who shot the fawn said to me, it's been clear from day 1 that you never intended to keep this fawn, that you've never intended to make a pet of it, that you were trying as best you could to get help and to get it to a wildlife rehabilitator. And so I know my neighbors, who also wrote a letter to the paper, are upset that they feel very disrespected and insulted, that they feel that they haven't been believed by Patrick Berry. There was a Fish and Wildlife person who came out about 2.5 weeks after the doe was found and said, he just arrived and he said, can you show me the dead doe to my neighbors? And they said, well, we'll try. We'll bring you into the woods and show you where we found it, but there's hundreds of trees down from the storm, and it's been 2.5 weeks.
So by then, the biologists should know the coyote would probably have.
Yeah, just going to say
It was very difficult to find the body.
something.
If you could see the woods, it looks like a tornado went off. I mean, there's just hundreds of trees down everywhere. But they know the Fish and Game officer who came to their house and took them into the woods. And the guy gave up after 10 or 15 minutes. He said, this is ridiculous. I'm never going to find this doe. After this happened, Patrick Berry said in the newspaper that the Fish and Game department had asked to see the dead doe and were refused.
You know, let me just say, you are a professional. You're a psychotherapist,
yeah.
And this is a smear on you.
Yeah. I mean, I don't understand. If they have a legitimate policy about fawns, and legitimate reasons why it's really a danger to the deer herd or to people for fawns to be rehabilitated, why can't that stand on its own merits? Why do they have to discredit me? Why do they have to distort what happened? And as a citizen of Vermont, it doesn't feel very good.
I'd like to invite the commissioner to come on and talk about this. Let me ask, what outcomes would you like to see at the state level with regard to fawn rehabilitation and Commissioner Berry's notion that this policy is non-negotiable? That's, to me, very,
he wrote that. He sent
for
that.
lack of a better word, arrogant. I mean, the commissioner works
right.
for us.
Yeah.
He works for the state. We are the taxpayers. Certainly, the statistics that our surrounding states show are scientific, and they would support the ability to allow rehabilitation, again, in our state. And I would imagine that this is something that we need to address with our legislators before they go back to Montpelier.
Deb
But-
Markowitz.
There are 4 outcomes that I'd like to see. One is I'd like to see the policy reversed, and we would like to see that there's rehabilitation options open for all the species in the state. Secondly, PR is needed, public education is needed, and it needs to be at the appropriate times of the year. In May, we need to be having public service announcements about fawn and why don't leave them in the wild. Thirdly, I think we need a public apology from the commissioner to Julia Gresser, because I think that in the newspapers, he has treated you very poorly and arrogantly. And I would like to see that. And then fourth, I'd like to see a change in the department where wildlife rehabilitation is supported and respected, and that has not been the case.
People may want to call Deb Markowitz. Nancy,
The head of the
Department
Agency
of-
for Natural Resources,
Right.
of which the Fish and Wildlife Department falls under.
right. And also people may want to call their legislator if they have a relationship with a legislator. I just feel like there's been sort of a brick wall when it comes to Patrick Berry. And yet somehow you get the impression that maybe there's some openness with other people who've been involved with this issue.
Well, it seems through your experience that when every fish and wildlife warden that you spoke to empathized with your situation.
Yeah.
They didn't like the policy.
Well, it's hard to say where they really stand. I mean, certainly their public relations skills were a little bit more fine-tuned and worthwhile, but where they really stand with the policy, I mean, I did get the feeling that there were different levels of support for the policy. Certainly, I got the impression that it's very difficult for some of the fish and game. One fish and game person told me, "Yeah, it's so sad this time of year. We get called because there's a doe down on the side of the road, and we go out and there's 2 little fawns just standing there, and we have to shoot them." And by the way, another family called me. Their 3 children, they had found injured or abandoned fawn, and they were taking care of it, and they called Fish and Game, and the Fish and Game officer came out and said, "Well, I have to take it and shoot it." And they said, "Well, the children need to say goodbye." So they woke their children up, and they said to the Fish and Game officer, "Please don't tell the children what's going to happen." And the Fish and Game officer said to the children, "I'm taking this fawn and I'm going to shoot it." And the kids were devastated.
You've gotta be
I'm
kidding
not
me.
the only one, is my point. I'm not the only person who's gone through some really sad situations in regard to fawns.
Okay. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming down and talking about
You're
this
welcome.
subject. And let's get some numbers up. So if you'd like to make some phone calls about this, this is our state, everybody. We can change. We can change. When we see a wrong, you can change it. Thank you very much for watching
you,
our
Sue.
show for the animals, and join us again next week.
At dusk, there came a turning. There was a moment when all was known. You could feel